In this video, I wanted to talk about the new moon and the determination of the month according to the Torah-based calendar. My purpose in doing this is not to say what the supposedly one true calendar system is. My intention is ultimately to share my thoughts and my questions on this issue. In doing so, I wanted to address the practice of sighting the moon and whether that is actually scriptural. And I wanted to discuss some of my reading on this subject as it pertains to other ancient practices. And I wanted to consider what we have to go off of as far as the law is concerned on this subject. One thing I've noticed over the years, and I'm sure that you probably have noticed this also, is that there are many different views on what the law supposedly teaches regarding the calendar. From what I've seen, the most popular calendars tend to either be the calendar the Orthodox use or the calendar that the more well-known or outspoken Karaite groups use. And that being said, there is no lack of alternative views on this subject. It seems to have more division and more emotional investment associated with it than possibly any other single issue of command. There are many calendars out there that people have devised and claim to be the true scriptural way. Calendars that may be derived from books other than the law, even calendars that have been created that require the text to be edited in order to support the view. Ultimately, this all points back to the fact that there is not a lot said explicitly in the written Torah about the calendar. Clearly, there is a calendar that is being used, and there are some commands given on it, but the exact way of doing everything does not appear to be explained. This has led to many trying to find subtle hints in the text to try to fill in the gaps. I don't blame people for doing that, and some of what I'm about to discuss could be seen as that, but I think we should recognize that is what is going on. Also, I think we should recognize that most of the calendars that have been devised create non-scriptural systems in order to make the calendar work, or at least to make it work the way the person thinks it should work. With regard to these calendars and the non-scriptural systems they require, this is something that years ago got me thinking more critically about this subject. In the early days of my seeking to observe the Torah, I tended to follow some of the prominent Karaite teachings. With regard to this issue, I was subscribed to a new moon sighting newsletter from Israel. My understanding was that they would go and try to see the new moon at the time they had calculated that the first visible crescent of the moon may be visible. And then they would report back whether 2 or more people had sighted it or not. If they saw it, then the new moon was supposed to begin the new month. Of course, this would be the ideal scenario. Something that would come up occasionally would be issues of weather and periods of cloudiness, such that sighting the moon was not possible, even though the moon should have been visible. If such a thing happened, from my understanding, they would usually go back the next evening and attempt to sight it again, and then they would usually see it. However, it didn't always work that way, and they would sometimes call the new moon, thus calling the beginning of the new month, whether the moon had actually been sighted or not. Even though they believed in sighting the moon, there also seemed to be this side rule that you could call the new month even if the new moon was never actually sighted. This would be done if the month reached the supposedly maximum possible length of 30 days. At that point, as I understood their practice, once the 30th day of the month had ended, it was automatically the new month, whether the moon had been sighted or not. This was a set of practices or a system I was exposed to in the past. This is how I remember it anyway. At some point, this got me to thinking, because if one understood the law as requiring that the moon needed to be sighted, then where is the rule coming from that says, in some cases, the moon doesn't need to be sighted? Or where is the rule that says the month or the year can only be certain lengths of time? I can understand why they would have those rules, at least with the length of the month, especially given the outside knowledge of the minimum and maximum length of time for the lunar cycle. So 30 days is the realistic maximum length that a month should be. While I understand that, the question came up for me because Sighting the moon was portrayed as the correct and the supposedly scriptural way to do it, so it was conspicuous to me that they also deemed it acceptable to call the moon without sighting it, and I knew there was no explicit statement in the law that said this. When we consider the text of the Torah, or even the rest of the Tanakh, nowhere are we explicitly told to sight the moon, and we certainly are not told to sight the new moon, and if you do not see it, start the month after 30 days regardless of sighting. Even if we see a logical basis for it, that is not explicitly specified in the text. One other thing I noticed was that whenever the month was not called because the new moon wasn't sighted when it should have been, it was often apparent the next evening that the crescent was much brighter and larger than the first crescent typically should be. Now, I accept there's going to be variation at times just because of the way the cycle of the moon works, but there were many times when it was apparent that the moon was in its second day rather than being the true first crescent. In that case, if we are supposed to be sighting the first crescent, then we can see in that case that this probably isn't the first crescent. So those are some of the things that I wondered about before and that caused me to think more about this issue. That's not to say that there is no justification or reasoning behind these traditions or those extra rules, but in using a system like that, I don't think we can say we are just going off of the written Torah. Maybe I'm being overly idealistic, but what I would like to see is a calendar that requires as few external elaborations as possible and that relies on as few implicit statements and assumptions as possible. I will share my thoughts in logic, but because of this situation, I have no intention of saying that this is the one true way or anything like that in this video. Now that I've talked about some of my questions and concerns about this issue, I want to go into some of my research. In the process, I'll be touching on some points that are more basic to the issue. In the text, as it pertains to the new moon and the beginning of the month, most of what we have to go off of is just based upon the meaning and usage of certain words and a few commands here and there. Outside of that, there are some passages in the Hebrew Bible where this is brought up, like Genesis 1:14 through 16. This passage says that the sun and the moon, and possibly the stars, are used for signs and appointments and days and years. From what I've seen before, this passage is sometimes used as if it were a proof text of a single particular view on the calendar. Beyond saying that the sun and the moon are involved in the calendar, there doesn't appear to be any plain implication from this passage alone as to how that is done. I used to debate regularly about the calendar, and a point of impasse would often involve this verse. The way my friend would see it is that this verse is dictating a specific way of handling the calendar and the calendar issues beyond just the fact that the sun and the moon are being used in it. Instead, inferring that they are being used in specific ways and only those ways. The way I view this verse is that it is vague. It doesn't tell us this is exactly how you do it. Getting into the words used in the law, specifically regarding the moon and the month, there are two sets of words that I'm going to focus on. The first set I'll just cover in brief. There are two words which are spelled using the same consonants. First is yareach. This word literally refers to the moon and is often accompanied by the word for sun. It does not appear much in the Torah and is isolated to two uses in Deuteronomy about not worshiping the moon. Of slightly more interest is the other word which is spelled using the same consonants, and that is yarach. This word appears to refer to the cycle of the moon, or in other words, a month. That being said, it is different from what we see when the dates of the holy days are given in the law, but it does appear in the Torah in reference to a period of time. In Deuteronomy 21:13, it refers to a period of mourning, presumably the number of days in the full cycle of the moon, thus a month of days. It also appears in Exodus 2:2 in reference to Moses being hidden for 3 of these, that is, presumably a time of 3 months. I will add that in the book of Kings, it is used in referring to the names of months. By the time the Book of Kings was around, the people of Israel were using names for the months which do not appear in the law, and whenever these are referenced in Kings, it appears as month of this or month of that. This isn't especially useful for us though, because it is distinct from how it appears in the Torah. Like I mentioned, when dates are given in the Torah, it does not use this word for month. While these two words are used for the moon and the moon cycle, they don't really tell us much as far as the Torah calendar is concerned. In fact, while one is used for a period of time, they are not used explicitly in the law in reference to the calendar at all. So that leads us to the other word which relates to the moon and the month. The word which appears and is typically translated as month in the law is Chodesh. This is what we see in passages like Leviticus 23 when it refers to the timing of the holy days. In my view, though, it does not literally mean month in its basic usage. One reason is that it is used as a specific day or specific point in time in 1 Samuel 25. And it is also spelled identically to the word for new and the verb for making new or renewing. These words can be seen clearly referring to that. Things like new Pharaoh, new house, new offering, etc. Considering that, and considering the word is identical in terms of the consonants, it would be logical to assume that there could be a connection. And instead of the word simply meaning month, it would seem to mean new moon at its basic meaning. This conclusion seems to be the consensus view, and it's backed up by traditional understanding of the law and of how the word and similar words appear in related languages. It appears to refer to the new moon, the day of its occurrence, and by extension, the time period of the month. As far as I can tell, this is the main thing we have to go off of textually for the timing of the month. If this word refers to the new moon, then I would infer that is the point in the phase of the moon where the month begins. There are two questions that could arise from this. One is defining what exactly new moon would be from the ancient perspective. The other is how to apply that practically. The modern way of understanding the new moon typically uses the dark moon, or the point of conjunction when the moon is completely dark. Other views include the first visible crescent, which would be around 1 to 3% illumination of the moon, either being sighted or not sighted depending on the view. And I've also heard arguments suggesting the full moon is the real new moon. In my research into ancient cultures and their views on this subject, there were a number of ways that the new moon was understood and used. Some cultures did use the practice of sighting the first visible crescent of the moon, similar to how some Karaite groups do today and how some Islamic groups apparently do also. Some were thought to use the lack of sighting the waning crescent in order to time the new month. So, as I understood, they would practice sighting the last crescent, and then when it ceased to be sighted, either the new month would be assumed or possibly assumed as starting the next day. While I have not tested this, supposedly there is about a 2/3 chance that the lack of sighting the waning crescent in the morning will be followed by the sighting of the new crescent on the evening which follows the next day. So some groups may have used that method to estimate the beginning of the month. In addition, some cultures did apparently use the full moon to determine the beginning of the month. We should also recognize that the rabbinic tradition on this, on how it was supposedly done, at least at the time of the temple, was to send people out to sight the first crescent. And then the high priest would make the judgment based on the reports, and he would ultimately decide and call the beginning of the month. Obviously, I'm not suggesting that we just take that tradition unquestioningly, but I feel it's appropriate to acknowledge it. The first point I will address is regarding the full moon. Some refer to Psalm 81:3 or 4, which uses the Hebrew word keseh. It says to blow in the Chodesh, shofar in the keseh, for day of our celebration. Because the evidence supports the meaning of full moon for this word, we might translate it as blow the shofar in the new moon, in the full moon for the day of our celebration. Some view this as equating the new moon with the full moon. I do not think that interpretation of the full moon being the new moon fits with what we know. For example, in how these words or their counterparts are used in other languages, there appears to be a consistent distinction and separation between them. I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that the full moon was used in that way by those peoples, and the apparent etymology of those words does not appear to support that either. I have heard an analogy before that tried to make the case in favor of the full moon being the actual new moon. The suggestion was that a house is not a new house until it is fully built. So the implication is the moon is being built up until the point that it is full, at which point it becomes new. If we take that comparison to its logical conclusion, say we have a literal house and then the house is torn completely down to nothing, then new construction begins on a house in its place. That new construction is actually the same house as the previously torn down house until it is done. So even if the old house was completely torn down, whatever is built in its place is initially considered to be the same as the old house. That logic does not seem sound to me. If we're looking at it from that perspective of the logic of new versus old, it makes more sense to me to suggest that the disappearance of the moon, followed by the reappearance of the new crescent, would be a much clearer distinction between new and old than the idea of the full moon being the new moon. From my perspective, the first crescent, at least in some form, seems to have the most evidence and seems to be the most logical choice for what defines the new moon. That leads to the question of how to practically apply that. I mentioned that one glaring issue for me is that sighting the moon and the practices which now surround that idea aren't apparently described in the Torah or even in the Tanakh for that matter. In fact, it appears that there is a reference to people presuming to know the timing of the new moon ahead of time. But that being said, it could be interpreted a different way, and also just because they were doing something in the Tanakh does not make it right. Regardless, if sighting the moon was such an important and necessary ritual, especially if it is supposedly combined with these extra rules, I think it's conspicuous that no one seems to talk about it. That's not proof, but I think it is kind of strange. I'll share my logic on this, but I recognize that there are some complications that it presents. If we recognize the new moon as being the first crescent, that is, the old moon was getting gradually darker and waning, and then it disappeared and effectively ceased at the point of darkness, then the new moon begins to appear and becomes the first waxing crescent of this new phase. If we accept all of that, then I would see three possible views on this. One is the concept of the sighting of the first crescent, which means it's not actually the true beginning of the moon phase, but it's at the point when the moon is bright enough that a person can see it with the naked eye. Of course, I've already shared some of my reservations on this. The second idea would be to recognize the moon as being new only when it could hypothetically be visible, but not actually requiring the sighting of it. So it would be new if it reached 1 to 3% illumination, regardless of whether we actually saw it. The third view, which is my current view, is that the status of the moon being new is just a matter of fact. The moon is either actually new or it is not. It's a matter of the state of the moon. It's not a matter of the state of our observation. What I mean is that once the old moon has ceased giving light and has become dark, then the moon begins to reflect light again in its new phase. By definition, that is what we are looking at as being the beginning of the new moon phase, thus it is the new moon. If the moon has gone from being dark to now beginning to reflect light again and create that new crescent, we're not going to say that if it is under 1 to 3% illumination that it would be considered the old moon. By matter of fact, it is the new light of the new moon phase, even if it is under that threshold. If it is actually about whether the moon is new, the moon is new at that point. One might wonder, though, whether the people historically saw the darkness, the conjunction, as a precise moment in time, or whether they saw it as taking place over the course of an entire day or something like that. That distinction could make a difference of at least one day in timing when one would call the new moon. From my reading, from the point of conjunction, it takes about 16 hours minimum to about 42 hours maximum until the moon is theoretically possible to see in that general geographic area. Even if we're not sighting it, how the people of that time would look at the duration of the conjunction of the dark moon would affect how they would look at the new moon. If we go by the logic of, if the moon is a new moon, it's a new moon whether we see it or not, then it's possible that we could consider less than 1% illumination, thus not visible, as being the new moon based on our knowledge now. And that may not have been what the people at the time did, even if they thought about this issue otherwise in a similar way. Then we might wonder, maybe we shouldn't be interpreting the new moon based upon taking its etymology overly literally and projecting our current knowledge upon it, because that may lead us to a different conclusion from what the word for new moon actually meant at the time. And even after deciding on one of those two views, there's also the question of practically applying it. Some possibilities other than sighting it directly include sighting the end of the old crescent, thus the approximate time of conjunction, and using that, which is something that may have been done around that time by other people, or possibly by calculating it or otherwise by estimating it. Personally, I'm not especially fond of any of those ideas, even though calculating the point of conjunction and then using the evening which follows that as the beginning of the new month would probably fit best with my logic on the issue. There's still the issue of how the people back then would have calculated it. I'm not saying that they couldn't have calculated it, but it's just not apparent what was done. I will point out again that the Torah does not explicitly command how to recognize it, so unless the word itself has the method somehow baked into the meaning such that it would have been evident at that time just from the word, then it may be possible that it doesn't matter exactly how it is done. Well, that possibility goes somewhat against some of my personal axioms regarding the law. Maybe it is just a matter of having a convention and then setting that convention to abide by whatever commands are given. To be clear on this, I do believe that everyone is supposed to be observing the same calendar. It's clear that would be necessary just in terms of enforcing the law in the Torah observant nation. There wouldn't be any way that the law could actually be enforced in any judicial or punitive sense if people just have the ability to say that they're going by some other calendar or interpreting things differently from the rest of the people. Clearly that is not what is intended. Clearly everyone is supposed to be on the same page with this. On the other hand, the lack of specificity does lead me to wonder what is supposed to be done. Was it just a matter at the time of continuing the cultural practice that they already had, basically using the calendar they already had, and then just adjusting certain things according to the commands as the commands were given? I certainly would accept that as a possibility. Is there more hidden in the meaning of words or in elusive coded messages in the law? Well, I believe there probably is more to the meaning of the word Chodesh, and I think that could present useful information. I personally am very reluctant to try to forcefully squeeze hints out of Scripture, because so much of the time whenever that is done, it just ends up being confirmation bias and apophenia, that is, seeing patterns out of irrelevant information or putting things together which were probably not intended. This goes on constantly in the study of Scripture, and I would like to try to avoid any semblance of going down that path again. Is there some kind of divine instruction on this issue in some other text? To me, if we're talking about an issue of command for the people, it would have to be something that was actually a part of the law. And with regard to a book like Jubilees, personally I'm not inclined to assume it to be legitimate, and I have yet to be given a reason as to why I should think that it's anything other than fraudulent. As a result, I think the best possibility going forward is trying to explore associations with the word Chodesh and related words. So those are some of my thoughts and questions regarding the calendar and regarding the new moon. Personally, I can see using the evening following conjunction for the beginning of the month, and this is what I had been doing for the past few years. And if I understand right, I think the Samaritans and some other groups do something similar. Also, I could see using the first visible crescent as the beginning of the month, whether it is actually visible or not, by using calculations or estimates. And also, I could see relying entirely on sighting the moon, and I could see it as being left up to the leadership to decide and call the moon based on their criteria. Whenever I decided to speak about this issue in this video, my initial aim was to essentially present the case for my interpretation and explain what I've been doing in recent times, while also leaving the door open for changing my mind if more evidence came along. The process of preparing a video requires me to think about the subject more thoroughly and to challenge myself on how much support there actually is for a given understanding. In this case, what stood out to me was the issue of how literally should we take the meaning of the word Chodesh? Because even if my personal logic is sound to me, that doesn't necessarily mean it fits with the historic understanding on the issue. Personally, I do not like this conclusion because I would like to see more apparent answers in the law and the language. It seems strange to me that sighting the moon was the practice, at least of later Jews, among other people, yet it is never clearly talked about in the Torah or in the Tanakh. Hopefully this issue will become more clear in the near future.